What's going on, you guys? Welcome back to the Neighborhood Podcast. One host of the podcast. My name is Kyle Dabro. As you can see, or if you guys are listening, it's just going to be me today. Kevin spent the weekend down in Miami. Looked like he was having a pretty good time down there. I don't think he was having that good of a time watching the Mavericks lose to the Heat. He went down to see the Mavericks play the Heat this past weekend, and unfortunately for him, he got to see Luka, Kyrie, and the Mavs take an L against Jimmy Butler and the Heat. When it comes to the Mavs, that's something that we'll get to early on in the episode. But yeah, Kevin will not be with us today. He'll be back for this episode later this week. So got to give him some time to recover. When it comes to Miami, Miami could do that to you. But I imagine he had a good time. And like I said, he'll be back later this week when we roll out another episode. But when it comes to the agenda, I'm going to keep this one pretty plain and simple, you guys. I'm going to have a couple topics for you. Nothing too crazy. This episode will be relatively quick compared to the episodes that Kevin and I usually have. So I'm just going to keep it short, but we'll go over the topics as I have them right here. First things first, we will go over the Mavericks. The Mavericks collapse continues based off of what they've been looking like the last couple of games. I believe they've lost 3 straight games. They have dropped down to the 11th seed in the Western Conference. And a lot of people are now starting to blame game. I think the potential of the Mavericks missing the play-in tournament entirely is a real possibility. And I mean, just kind of browsing through social media, you could definitely tell that the narratives are starting to spin up about, all right, who are we going to blame? Are we going to blame Luka? Are we going to blame Kyrie? Are we going to blame Mark Cuban, Jason Kidd? I'm going to give my opinion on it. I imagine if Kevin were here, he would have plenty to say about this. We did kind of talk about this last week, but just based on what the Mavericks have looked like over the last couple games, I got to talk about it. So after that, we'll kick it to in the NBA. We'll keep it within the Western Conference. We're going to focus on the race for the 10th seed, the final spot in the play-in tournament scenario. So as of right now, when you look at the 10th seed, there are teams like the Mavericks, as I just mentioned, the Thunder, the Jazz. Some of these teams are competing for that 10th seed. And with only about 3 to 4 games left, respectively, for each team, I'm just going to give my opinion on who I think is going to get that final seed to get into the play-in tournament and then potentially try to get into the playoffs in the Western Conference. So there's a lot of that whole situation is very dynamic. It's very fluid in the Western Conference. When it comes to the Eastern Conference is pretty much set up. There's not going to be a lot of movement when it comes to the seeds at this point. So the Western Conference is really where everything is kind of up in the air right now. And we'll see how things play out over the next couple of days or so, because the regular season is going to wrap up really quick. Like I said, there's only 3 or 4 games left in the season. And then after that, we'll kick it over to the NFL. Something that caught my eye this past weekend was something that George Kittle was talking about in regards to his recovery. He took a pretty deep dive into essentially the methods and essentially the techniques that he has to go over when it comes to his recovery methods day in and day out through the regular season. And when it comes to that topic specifically, uh, I'll pretty much just read verbatim the quote that he mentioned about essentially playing football. Essentially, the way that he looks at it is it's like getting hit by a car every weekend. Essentially, it's a car accident every time that he steps out there on the field. And it was very interesting reading the depth of his recovery methods. And when it comes to George Kittle is one of the best tight ends in the game. And it was a very interesting, but I think it was a true assessment of what it's like being a football player. And we'll dive into that once we get into that topic. And then after that, we'll kick it over to the 2 teams that we focused on with the adjustments that they need to make at this point in the offseason. The 2 teams that we'll go over will be the Washington Commanders and the Pittsburgh Steelers. As you guys know, we've talked about this before. The NFL draft is coming up pretty soon, so we'll focus on some areas of need with each team, and then pretty much that will wrap up the episode. So without further ado, we'll dive into this Mav segment. All right, so with the Mavs, I know Kev is going to have a fit over this one, just based off of what happened this past weekend with the Mavericks. So when it came to this past weekend with the Mavs, they lost both of their road games. They lost to the Heat earlier in the weekend, and then they lost an absolute crusher against the Hawks on Sunday. And that was despite the fact that Kyrie dropped 41 points in Atlanta. And unfortunately for him, he had the game losing foul that set up 2 game winning free throws for the Hawks. And even though that they lost that game, I was watching the highlights of the final possession. And Luka, man, he took an absolute miracle shot type three and damn near drained it. I mean, it was only off by about 3 or 4 inches. And that would have been the difference between the Mavs winning and the Mavs losing in that specific possession. But when it comes to the Mavs are in a very tricky situation here. They are the 11th seed in the Western Conference. They are currently out of the play-in tournament situation, and they've lost 3 straight games. And in some of these games, man, it's really, really tough to watch them sometimes. Because, look, when it comes to Luka and Kyrie, there's one thing I will say about them. They are playing up to snuff as far as I see it. Ever since Kyrie's arrived, Kyrie, when it comes to just him specifically and the ability that he puts on the court night in and night out on the offensive side, I can't criticize anything about that. Guy's averaging about 25 to 26 points per game. He's shooting over 50% from the field. And like I said, against the Hawks, he dropped 41 points. And what else are you going to ask more for him? You know, when it comes to Luka, Luka's still scoring at a high clip. And, you know, this is the thing that I think we have to kind of pay attention to with the Mavs. Ever since the Mavs traded for Kyrie, the offensive side of the ball has never been an issue. To me, and this is something that Kevin has talked about ad nauseum for years, is that their defensive presence, especially with their big men, has been essentially non-existent. And honestly, I was just perusing through some of the stats to kind of see where the Mavs are ranked in the NBA. And when it comes to Kevin's assessment of Dallas not having a big, he is correct. When I look at their rebounding stats, they are in last place. The Mavs as a team average 38 rebounds per game. They're the only team in the NBA who averages a rebound total in the 30s. Every other team is 40 and above. And then when it comes to the offensive rebounds, they are essentially dead last in the NBA. And, you know, this is something that I think we have to kind of look with, specifically with the Mavs. When it comes to the Mavs, the fact of the matter is, when you don't have a strong enough center presence, whether that's in your starting rotation or coming off the bench, it's going to leave the team in a situation where you're not going to get a lot of second chance points. And even when it comes to second chance points with the Mavs are top 3, top 5 worst teams in the NBA when it comes to getting second chance points. And then you look at some of these games that the Mavs have been in with the Kyrie trade taking place, they have lost some of these games by 1 possession. I was looking through their games just in 2023. They have lost 4 games by 1 possession. There have been some games, I think it's been around probably like 8 or 10 games this year, where they've lost by 1 possession. And if you were to just factor in, if the Mavs had a more competent big to roll with for the entire season, more than likely, they'd be able to get some of these second chance points. And if you look at some of these point totals that they're getting in some of these games that they're losing by, especially by 1 possession, or maybe even 2, if you get 6, 8 second chance points, there's a good chance that you probably walk away with that win. Either that or you knock down your free throws. And when it comes to the free throw percentage that the Mavs are shooting this year, it's not really an issue. And I know that Kev has talked about the fact that Luka turns the ball over too much. He specifically may turn the ball over, but as a team, the Mavericks are actually one of the best teams in the NBA and not turning the ball over. So I will give the Mavs credit in that regard. They don't make the situation worse by turning the ball over because they only average 11, 12 turnovers per game. You compare that to the rest of the NBA. The worst teams in the NBA are committing 14, 15 turnovers a game. So it could be worse if you're looking at it from the Mavs perspective. But, man, this blame game is something that I've noticed over really the last couple of days with the Mavericks, because the possibility of the Mavs missing the play-in tournament entirely is now a real possibility. And when it comes to their next couple of games, they have to step up here, because if they don't, there's going to be a lot of blame going around. And I know Kev has focused a lot of his blame towards Jason Kidd with the rotations that he's been running, certain players getting time on the court, and then maybe some other players maybe deserving more time on the court and not getting it. But, man, for me, I look at this as just a team failure. This is essentially a collapse is what we're seeing with Dallas. And I know people could look at multiple different ways on who to blame when it comes to maybe this person, that person. But to me, this is just a cohesive failure. This was a risk that the Mavs were rolling with. And unfortunately for them, granted, they got some more scoring with Kyrie in the fold, but defensively, they have taken a step back. They are giving up 115, 120 points a game sometimes when they're going up against teams. And not only that, they are presented an opportunity to play with one of the best players in the world, with Kyrie Irving, alongside Luka Doncic, and it has not worked out. They are 7-12 since acquiring Kyrie Irving. And when I look at the situation right now with Dallas, if they fall short and they miss the play-in tournament entirely, it's going to be a very long offseason for Dallas. And honestly, this is going to be a very interesting situation going into this offseason. I'll just leave it at that. All right, so up next, we are going to dive into the race for the 10th seed in the Western Conference for the play-in tournament. So as of right now, just to give you guys the rundown of the current situation in the Western Conference right now, I'll actually start from the 5 seed and then work down to the 12 seed, because there's potentially going to be a lot of shifting that we could see over the next couple of days, despite the regular season pretty much wrapping up right now. So I'll start at the 5, work down to the 12. So as of right now, we have a tie at 5th place between the Clippers and the Warriors at a 41-38 record. At the 7th seed, we've got the Lakers, who have been on a really good stretch of late. At the 8th seed, we have the Pelicans at a 40-38 record. They're actually tied with the Lakers, so you could say both teams are tied for 7th. At the 9th seed, we have the Timberwolves at a 39-40 record. At 10, we have the Thunder, who would currently be the last team to get into the play-in tournament right now, at a 38-41 record. At the 11th seed, we have the Dallas Mavericks, who are sitting at a 37-42 record. They would currently be out of the play-in tournament situation by 1 game. And then the 12th seed is the Utah Jazz at a 36-42 record. So let's pretty much set the scene, or now that the scene is set, who's going to get this 10th seed? So the way that I see it is, it's going to come down, I think, to really about 4 teams. It's going to come down to the Jazz, the Mavericks, the Thunder, and the Timberwolves. So when I look at the Timberwolves, I'll start with them. The Timberwolves had a really bad loss this past weekend. They lost to the Trailblazers in a game where the Timberwolves were favored to win that game by 19.5 points. They were almost a 20-point favorite going into that game, and they lost that game. It was one of the most wildest upsets that I think we've seen probably in the last 25 to 30 years. You know, typically when you watch an NBA game, some team may be favored by like 5, 6, maybe 10 points at most. But when you're essentially a 20-point favorite going into a game against Portland, who has given up this season, they've shut down Damian Lillard. That's a whole different situation that we got into last week, where he may be on a new team next year. And like I said, Trailblazers, they're already eliminated from the playoffs. To lose to a team like that, if you're the T-Wolves, that's a bad loss to have. And when it comes to the Thunder are kind of in a tricky situation right now. They have not been on a good stretch of late. Granted, they still are the 10th seed, but you know, they've lost 2 straight games. Even I'll bring up the Timberwolves again. They've lost 3 straight games. So And then when it comes to the Mavericks at the 11th seed, they've lost 3 straight games. We just went over them a couple of minutes ago. And then the Jazz are also on a 2-game losing streak. So all of these teams that are vying for this 10th seed right now, they are not playing well. So when I look at the Timberwolves, even though that they haven't been playing well of late, I think they'll probably keep that 9th seed unless they lose out all of their games, which I don't see happening because as of right now, they play the Nets, the Spurs, and the Pelicans. I think the Nets game is going to be interesting because the Nets still have something to play for in the Eastern Conference because they're at the 6th seed. And I think if I'm the Nets, I don't want to drop into a situation where I'm playing in the play-in tournament if I could just advance to the playoffs without dealing with it. So that's going to be a very competitive game between the T-Wolves and the Nets. After that, they got to play the Spurs. The Spurs are one of the worst teams in the NBA. Even though that's a road game for the T-Wolves, I think there's a good chance that they could win that one. And then it's going to come down to the Pelicans. That's going to be a very interesting game. It's going to be a competitive game because the Pelicans still have something to play for. They could try to adjust their seed in the play-in tournament. So that's going to be a very interesting game. But I think when it comes to the Timberwolves, I think they'll be fine. I think they'll be able to make it into the play-in tournament. Outside of that, we can look at the Oklahoma City Thunder. Now, the Thunder, I will say, when you look at SGA has been phenomenal this year. And he and Kevin Durant had a really good back and forth battle this past weekend where they both put up 30-plus points. Phoenix ended up winning that game. Phoenix is now on a 5-game winning streak. But when it comes to the Thunder are basically treading water at this point. There's no other way to put it. Let's look at their games that they have left. So as of right now, they have to play the Warriors on Tuesday. That's going to be a very competitive game because when you look at the Warriors are in the 6th seed right now, but the Lakers are really nipping at their heels. And, despite the fact that the Warriors were the defending champs from last year, they've had a very up and down year this year. And going into this game, this is a chance for the Thunder to kind of get back into a groove and hopefully find some sort of footing to maintain that 10th seed. And then after that, they have to play the Jazz. That's still a good game for them to win. Even though that the Jazz have something to play for, the Thunder can't slack off for that game. And the way that I see it, they have to play up to standard for that game if they want to maintain their situation for the play-in tournament. And then they close out the year against the Grizzlies. Now, the Grizzlies could be resting some starters. That game's at home for the Thunder. I wouldn't be surprised if the Thunder end up winning that one because I think more than likely the Grizzlies are going to be resting players for that game to close out the year. Then we'll dive into the Mavericks. That's Kev's team, and I imagine he would have plenty to say about this. But as of right now, they have 3 games left. They have to play the Kings at home, the Bulls at home, and the Spurs at home. So their last 3 games, they're all at home. If they were to go on a 3-game win streak, I think that they could potentially get back into that 10th seed. They would have to hope that the Thunder would lose one of their games, would have to lose 2 of their games to potentially get back in, because as of right now, the Mavericks, they are the 11th seed, and they're 1 game behind the Thunder at this point. And then when it comes to the Jazz, I believe the Jazz have 4 games left. They have to play the Lakers twice. Let me pull up their schedule here because I know that they're still a couple games behind the Thunder. I believe they're a game and a half back at the 10th seed. So they have to play the Lakers, the Thunder, the Nuggets, and then the Lakers to close out the year. That's a very tough road as far as I see it when it comes to the Jazz. So when I look at the situation, I think the Mavericks have a chance to get back into that 10th seed, but they have to hope that the Thunder lose a game or 2. The Thunder have a good chance to maintain that 10th seed. But if I were really just to pick one team here to get that 10th seed to get into the Western Conference play-in tournament, I think as of right now, I'm probably going to roll with the Thunder. When it comes to the Mavericks, unless the Mavericks, really get on a hot streak to close out the year, and then you look at a team like the Thunder who have been competitive, yet they've fallen short over the last couple of games. I think the Thunder have a chance to really showcase what they're made of to close out the year to get this 10th seed. But it's really going to come down to these two teams as far as I see it. It's going to come down to the Thunder and the Mavericks. If I had to bet, just based off of what I've seen, I think the Thunder have a better chance to get in. But I will say, the Mavericks do have home games. They have a home stretch to close out the year. And I wouldn't be surprised, even though that Kev is pretty much banking against the idea that the Mavs would get into the play-in tournament situation. You got a 3-game home stretch in front of your home crowd. That could be enough motivation to get into the play-in tournament. So, to me, this is going to come down to the Thunder and the Mavs. If I had to guess, I'm going to roll with the Thunder by a hair if I had to really put it like that. But as of right now, if I had to pick, that 10th seed would go to the Oklahoma City Thunder, and I'll just leave it at that. All right, so up next, we are going to transition into our next segment. The next segment is going to be on George Kittle. George Kittle was on the Theo Vaughn podcast a couple days ago, and he took a pretty interesting route when it came to his description of what it's like playing in the NFL. And honestly, just to kind of give you guys an idea before I dive into the quote, I'll just read it verbatim here. It's not a rosy picture. I'll just leave it at that. And Kevin and I have talked about this before when it comes to what it's like playing in the NFL based off of the accounts of what we've seen from players who are former players and players that are currently playing in it. And essentially, George Kittle's sentiment essentially follows it to a T. So I'll read the quote as I have it right here. So George Kittle on the Theo Vaughn podcast said, "I'm in multiple car accidents every Sunday. I've had games where I hyperextended my knee. That's going to affect your season. Or you burst a bursa sac in your knee. That's going to be there for several weeks. And if you get lucky, you don't have to deal with stuff like that. It's a little bit better, but you're still going to get into these car accidents. On Monday, I have to do a big lower body lift. I have to move otherwise, or you get really stiff and you get more sore. So you do a big lift, try to stay a little bit more mobile. Mondays, I usually feel okay. Tuesdays are really, really hard days. You kind of feel everything, especially when we play on the East Coast. We have a 5-hour flight back and we get home at 4 a.m. Those are tough. You get in these car accidents and it takes like Thursday to Fridays when I start to feel like myself again. The more into the season you get, the more your body is wear and tear, wear and tear, wear and tear. Really now how I see it is, if I'm not doing football, I'm doing recovery. And that's pretty much his description, word for word on the Theo Vaughn podcast. I wouldn't say this past weekend, but in the last couple of days. And, when it comes to some of the accounts that players have put out there about essentially the nature of the game, everybody knows it. It is a violent game. Derek Wolfe was just on the Joe Rogan podcast a couple of weeks back, and the amount of wear and tear that he had to go through, the amount of pain and the amount of injuries that he sustained throughout his career, it was unbelievable. And when it comes to the NFL, Derek Wolfe was essentially saying that there's a very good chunk of the NFL who's more than likely addicted to Adderall. And just the amount of supplements that these guys have to take just to stay out there on the field and dealing with multiple injuries at the same time. It's absolutely commendable that these guys are putting their bodies out on the line week in and week out for, honestly, I would say our entertainment, but even for themselves. They're getting paid millions of dollars a year. And, when it comes to those game checks, even if they're not feeling 100% and they're given the green light to play, they're going to go out there and play whatever the consequences are. And when it comes to the NFL and how they've set up their schedule, especially with these Thursday night games, man, you get into a recovery situation where, let's say you play on Sunday. You have potentially, 3.5 days, 4 days at most to recover for a Thursday night game. Like George Kittle said, by Thursday, you're kind of feeling yourself again, but depending on what sort of injury you may be carrying on from the game prior, you may not be 100% going into those Thursday games. And I imagine, going from a Sunday game to a Thursday game in a 3.5 to 4 day stretch, man, that is not an easy turnaround. And now there's a potential of multiple teams playing multiple games on Thursday nights. Typically when we would see a Thursday night game with one team in particular, that would pretty much be it. Unless you were to get a Thanksgiving Day game where you play two Thursday night games in a year, that would really be only for a specific number set of teams each year. But now there's a very good chance that multiple teams are going to have two games on Thursday night from here on out. But when it comes to George Kittle, obviously, I respect the honesty. And when it comes to his account, I have no reason not to believe it. So when it comes to just the effort that these guys put out on the field, game in and game out, it really is something to behold because, I mean, these guys it's a violent sport. These guys are dealing with it week in and week out, and I definitely appreciate it. I mean, even for someone like me, when I was playing high school football, I remember in my senior year, I was dealing with shin splints. I was dealing with an ankle injury that lingered for 4 to 5 weeks. And for me specifically, my last game that I played in high school football, in that senior year, that was the healthiest that I had been the entire year. Because pretty much throughout the middle of the season, I had to get my shin splints worked on. I messed up something in my ankle where I felt some sort of pop in my ankle, and I basically had to get my ankle wrapped like a boot going out there for a month plus. And, in the grand scheme of things, the injuries that I dealt with were relatively minor. You got guys who are blowing out ACLs, who are tearing meniscuses, and even with some of the offensive linemen, they may get a pretty bad injury in their knee. They'll put a knee brace on and they'll just go back out there on the field, despite playing on what most would consider a pretty bad injury. I mean, if I were to tear my meniscus right now, depending on the severity of it, there's probably no way I'd be able to play through it unless I got shot up with a bunch of painkillers before going into the game. And I imagine when it comes to these guys, they're doing that game in and game out if they're dealing with some sort of significant injury. But no, when it comes to the accounts of George Kittle in particular, I mentioned Derek Wolfe going on the Joe Rogan podcast a couple of weeks ago. These guys are just built different. These guys are dealing with injuries. They're still going into the gym, dealing with injuries. And, the fact that they can go 17 games, and then if they were to make it into the playoffs and potentially go for a Super Bowl, dealing with all those injuries, that's a lot of adversity to face. And I really give a tip to the cap to these guys for making it happen under the circumstances that they're presented with. Granted, it was their choice. They decided to go down this route and play professional football. But, in the end, I think even if you were to tell these guys, look, there's more than likely a very good chance you're going to play hurt. I'd say probably 75, 85% of the time throughout the regular season. There's just no other way to put it. But with the opportunity that these guys are given to go out there each Sunday or Monday or Thursday and make millions of dollars for not only themselves, but to better their families and better the situation that they have, potentially generationally speaking, I don't think that these guys would pass it up. I think these guys would still deal with the consequences of the sport. They could potentially be dealing with concussions, potentially getting CTE down the line. But I still believe that the risk is worth the reward for these guys, and that's why they go out there and do it. And as far as I see it, people have talked about the idea of maybe football would essentially fade away based off of the CTE issue that the NFL has been dealing with, and they've tried to make adjustments in penalizing head hits more effectively, changing the actual helmets to make them better or absorb the hits better. But I still believe that these guys would still go out there and try to make a living for themselves and their family. So I don't see that trend turning away from football anytime soon. And, when it comes to the people that consume it, especially the people like me, where we talk about it pretty much day in and day out, the entertainment value is still there. Granted, Kevin and I can look at the situation at hand, and there's definitely some issues that we have with the NFL. But when it comes to the players that go out there on the field day in and day out, I appreciate what they do. Um, Obviously, for the entertainment value, it's definitely appreciated because there's no shortage of entertainment that they display game in and game out. But when it comes to George Kill's statement on just the nature of the game, it does put things into perspective, and sometimes that's necessary because I tell you what, these guys are not soft. These guys deal with injuries game in and game out, and compared to essentially the rest of the country, I don't know if a lot of people could deal with the pain that these guys deal with game in and game out. But honestly, I'll just leave it at that. All right, so up next, we are going to kick it to two teams within the NFL and some of the offseason needs to set them up for a better 2023. The first team that we're going to go over is going to be the Washington Commanders. The Commanders last year had an 8-1 record. They fell short in making the playoffs this past season. So just from the outside in, it looks like they're going to have to make some decent moves internally to set them up for better success going into next year. As of right now, when it comes to the Commanders draft order in the first round, they have the number 16 pick in the first round this year. Depending on how they use that pick, it could potentially hit a key area of need going into this season. So when I look at the Commanders, there's three areas that I could look at that they need to address sooner rather than later. The third one, it mostly has to do on the field, specifically play by play. So I'll leave that one for the end. But when it comes to position by position, the first thing I got to start off with is the quarterback. When it comes to the quarterback position with the Commanders, it has been a very fluid situation. And that's honestly something that you do not want to have at what you could say is the most important position on the offense. Because when you look at last year in particular, it was just a revolving door at the quarterback position. You had Carson Wentz, you had Taylor Heinicke, you had Sam Howell. And when you look at the current depth chart right now with the Commanders, both Carson Wentz and Taylor Heinicke, they're gone. They are no longer on this roster. And as of right now, they have Sam Howell as their potential starting quarterback, and they have Jacoby Brissett as the backup listed on their depth chart. When I look at this quarterback situation with Washington right now, I don't think it's going to be one that's going to lead to more success. I think it's going to be very similar, or it's going to be akin to what we've seen from the Commanders pretty much for the last 5-10 years, which is just inconsistent quarterback play. And it unfortunately leads to an out of sorts offense. Because when you look at the offensive categories, just in major statistical categories with the Commanders, they're essentially a bottom tier team in the passing game. And, they're only getting on average somewhere between 300 to 325 yards per game. You're going to need to do more than that. I'm not saying that you need to be the Kansas City Chiefs and go out there and average 425 yards a game. But when it comes to the offense is sputtering simply just because they just don't have a competent quarterback at that spot. So when it comes to the number 16 pick in the draft, I highly doubt that they're going to use it on a quarterback. They could address some other areas on the offense. And trust me, the next position I'm going to get to is potentially an area that they could look at in the draft. But, man, when it comes to this quarterback situation for the Commanders, this is not a winning formula. Unless Sam Howell goes out there and proves me otherwise, which, to be fair, I should give him the chance to see what he's capable of. But, just based off of what I've seen with the Commanders over the last couple of years, I don't know if Sam Howell's going to be the guy to get this team over the hump to get into the playoffs. From an offensive perspective, they have some decent playmakers here. You've got Brian Robinson Jr. in the backfield alongside Antonio Gibson. You've got Terry McLaurin. You've got Dotson. Now you have Curtis Samuel. I mean, this is not a bad wide receiving core. And then you have Logan Thomas as your tight end. Things could be a lot worse. I'll just leave it at that when it comes to their skill position on the offensive side of the ball. But if the team's going to go anywhere, it's going to have to be competent quarterback play. And I'm just not banking highly that Sam Howell's going to get it done compared to above average quarterbacks in the NFL. But there's another area that we need to focus on with the offense, and that is the offensive line. The offensive line is not making things anything better, or they're just not making things better as a whole, really. They gave up 48 sacks last year. When you look at the rest of the NFL, that's bottom tier. Now, granted, it could be a lot worse. It could be like the Broncos or the Bears where they're giving up over 50, 55 sacks. But 48 is not a number that I imagine the coaches and the front office are happy with. Because, even if you had someone like Carson Wentz this past year or Taylor Heineke, they just didn't have a lot of time to work with. And that was despite the fact that, the Commanders were not that bad of a team. Commanders were 8-1 last year. You switch this offensive line issue into a net positive, the Commanders are probably a playoff team. And then you combine that with the fact that their defense is solid across the board. They were top 5 in yards allowed last year. It's kind of crazy when you think about it. You wouldn't really consider the Commanders a top tier team in a major statistical category. But on the defensive side of the ball, they have that down to a science right now. And unfortunately, when it comes to the offense, they are just out of sorts. And when it comes to the offensive line, I think this is going to be an area that they're going to have to focus on going into the draft. I wouldn't be surprised if they were to draft high in the draft to potentially bring a competent piece into the offensive line going into next year just to help out with the pass protection. You got to give your quarterback time to be able to work with him. 48 sacks last year. That's just not going to get it done. And that was despite the fact that, the Commanders, realistically, they were probably only 2 wins away from making the playoffs. So, if they were to fix some of the things on the offense with the quarterback situation and then the offensive line situation, I think it could be a net positive. And then just one area that I have left to attend to is probably their turnovers. When you look at the Commanders this past year, they were bottom tier in their turnover differential. They were just turning the ball over way too frequently. Most of that had to do with the quarterback situation with Carson Wentz and Taylor Heineke. But, you're going to have to get into a situation where you have to be in a net positive when it comes to your net turnovers throughout the season. Last year, they were subpar in that category. I believe they were like probably the 6th or 7th worst team in the NFL in that stat. So, they definitely have to clean some things up on the offense. There's no doubt about it. Defensively, this team is solid. From a passing defense perspective, this team is elite. And they have some good pass rushers with Montez Sweat. You have Chase Young. Like, the defense is not an issue here. That's why I'd never even looked at the defense when it came to the team as a whole when I was reviewing the team. But as of right now, to really just round this out, I got to focus on the quarterback situation. That definitely needs to be something that is focused on throughout the season. They definitely need to bolster this offensive line and then limit their turnovers. If they can do those things, maybe the Commanders can get into the playoffs next year. I think that that's a realistic expectation if they're able to address those things. If they stay essentially in the same boat going into next year based off of what they had last year, I think it's going to be a very similar result. They're going to finish around a 7-10 record or an 8-1 record or maybe a 9-8 record. It's going to be in an average area. That's pretty much how I see it. But if they were to address those things, I think it could be a net positive and they could potentially make the playoffs next year. All right, and then the last team that we're going to go over is going to be the Pittsburgh Steelers. And when it comes to the Pittsburgh Steelers this past year, they finished at a 9-8 record. They fell just short in making the playoffs. They actually had a pretty nice ending to their season. They went on a 4-game win streak, but unfortunately for them, they were 1 game behind the Baltimore Ravens. The Ravens were able to get one of the wild card spots. But when it comes to the Steelers were going through a little bit of a transitionary period. Obviously, the year before, Ben Roethlisberger had retired, and now they're bringing Kenny Pickett into the fold. And granted, when it comes to the Steelers are in a little bit of what I would consider a growing pain stage. Simply just because, when you go from somebody like Big Ben to Kenny Pickett, I can't really criticize the quarterback position too much because Pittsburgh is rolling with their guy that they drafted last year. And, when it came to just me assessing the team as a whole, I can't really go too hard on Kenny Pickett because he was a rookie last year. He showed some flashes, and granted, he wasn't Patrick Mahomes, but I will say that it seemed as time went along in the season, he was starting to gain a little bit more confidence in his overall play, and we'll see whether or not that it transitions going into this next year. There still are some areas of need that I could look at with the team. When I look at the wide receiver position, I think that they could probably add a decent third option behind Deontay Johnson and George Pickens. When it comes to Deontay Johnson and George Pickens, these guys are extremely athletic. They're able to gain separation. George Pickens has this amazing ability to just snatch down these amazing catches, and that's despite the fact that he may be going up against really good one-on-one coverage against a defense that he's going up against. So it seems as if the Steelers have a very good job, or they have a very good coaching department in being able to get these wide receivers up to speed really, really quick. Really over I'd say the last 10 to 15 years, they've been able to generate really good wide receiver talent. You could look at names like Antonio Brown, Juju Smith-Schuster, and now you could look at guys like Deontay Johnson and now George Pickens. I think if they were to add a third option, it could be a net positive for them. We could see what happens with Calvin Austin III. He's still relatively young in his NFL career, so maybe they give him a chance to be able to show his skills at a high level and get him into some situations that could be beneficial for him and the team. But when it comes to that wide receiving core, maybe with the draft coming up, maybe they look at potentially drafting a wide receiver, maybe somewhere in the mid rounds of the NFL draft. And then after that, when it comes to the Steelers, I would say that another area that they would have to focus on, just to kind of focus on the quarterback situation here, is give Kenny Pickett just time to work with. I wouldn't say that the Steelers had necessarily a really bad offensive line. They only gave up 38 sacks last year, which is essentially middle tier. It's not as bad as some of the teams that Kevin and I have covered before. I mean, some of these teams that we've covered have given up, 45, 50, 55 sacks plus. So things could be a lot worse when it comes to Pittsburgh's offensive line. I think the main thing that we have to see is Kenny Pickett just get more time in the pocket and be able to hit his targets more effectively. Because if he's able to do that, I think it's going to really open up this offense. Because I think if you're a Steelers fan and you look at the offense from this past year, you just get the sense it was just meh. It was just subpar. And I think a lot of it just had to do with the inexperience of Kenny Pickett. So, and that was despite the fact that when it came to Pittsburgh, then their offense and their turnover differential, they were actually up in that department. And, when you have a rookie quarterback, if you're in a net positive situation in that turnover margin, you roll with that every day of the week. It's just, when it comes to the Steelers seem to just be mired in this growing pain stage on the offensive side of the ball. And I think this just has to come with the territory of being able to develop the talent that they have in their roster. I think when it comes to someone like Najee Harris in the running game, when it comes to the opposing defenses that they're going up against, Pittsburgh has a one-dimensional offense because they know that Kenny Pickett is limited. And it could just be that he's just a rookie quarterback. And, if they're able to scheme against the offense and being able to slow down Najee Harris and make Kenny Pickett beat them, that's a formula that the defenses are going to roll with. So I think that the main thing for me is most of my issues when it comes to the Steelers are mostly predicated on the offensive side of the ball. Defensively, they're not that bad. Defensively, they're either top 10 or middle of the pack in some of these categories. Passing defense wise, they're pretty solid in that category. Run defense, they're not too bad. The amount of points that they're giving up is essentially top 10 in the NFL. So, I mean, overall, things could be a lot worse in Pittsburgh. Like I said, they finished at a 9-8 record. Being 9-8 and only one game away from potentially making the playoffs, that's a pretty good formula to work with if you have a rookie quarterback who's still developing in the NFL. But, for me, typically we do about 3 areas of concern when it comes to NFL teams. The only ones that I can think of are mostly quarterback and wide receiver related. I don't really see an issue with Najee Harris. It seems to me that it's more of a defensive scheme issue that the Steelers need to overcome as an offense to be able to get this team running and gunning. And that mostly has to do with Kenny Pickett's experience, or inexperience, I should say. So for me, I'm just going to round it out simply as this. Keep developing Kenny Pickett. Maybe address the wide receiver position by potentially bringing on someone in the draft. And then if you're looking at this from an offensive line perspective, just give Kenny time. I think if you're able to do those three things effectively, I think it's going to set them up potentially to make the playoffs this year. Are they going to make it? Who knows? You know, the situation in Baltimore is very fluid with the Lamar Jackson situation. You've got Cleveland, who has Deshaun Watson in the fold, so they're looking to make moves to get higher up in the AFC North. But when I look at it right now, I would say that Pittsburgh has an outside shot to make the playoffs, but they have to continue to develop Kenny Pickett in a proper manner and try to give him time to work with, and hopefully it leads to some sort of offensive flourishing going into next year. But outside of that, you guys, that's pretty much going to wrap it up for me. I tried to keep it short and concise. Typically we run over an hour plus with these episodes, so if I was able to keep it underneath that, I'll take that any day of the week. But once again, thank you guys for tuning in, whether you guys were watching on YouTube or listening to us on the audio platforms. We definitely appreciate the support. Like I said at the top, Kevin will be back for our next episode later in the week. Kind of like I said at the top, the NBA is coming to a close. The MLB just started their season. The NHL is getting very close to the playoffs with teams clinching berths into the playoffs. So it's going to be a lot of content for you guys over the next couple of weeks. So definitely stay tuned. But once again, thank you guys for listening or watching, and we will see you guys later this week.